We're here today to talk about this book, which is entitled Press Freedom in Contemporary Asia, but we are the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, so we're going to focus a bit on Asia, as I understand it. And our two speakers are the two co-editors of the book. So Professor Jeff Kingston, next to me, is the Director of Asian Studies and Professor of History at Temple University in Japan. Has published all sorts of books on Japan, and I frequently see you quoted in the press as well on various things. And then with him is Dr. Tina Barrett. Dr. Tina Barrett is dear to us because she's a former Daiwa scholar that we sent out to Japan, I can't remember how many years ago, but yeah, we probably don't want to mention it. And she's Associate Professor of Political Science at Sophia University, so both of them in Japan. And she publishes on politics and media freedom, which is obviously what we're going to talk about. Seem to have a bit of a speciality for Russia. So as I understand it, Tina is going to speak first and is going to give us a broad overview, and then Jeff is going to focus down more on Japan. So over to you.
Well, thank you all very much for coming and braving the elements today, and also potentially pandemics as well. We're very grateful to you, and also to the Daiwa Foundation for having us this evening. I'm afraid we can't probably offer you a very jolly evening because Asian media freedom is a bit of an oxymoron and a bit of a depressing topic, actually. So ours isn't going to be a very optimistic talk, I don't think. So with totalitarianism, censorship, intimidation, physical violence against journalists, it's not a particularly safe place in the world to be a journalist in the Asia Pacific. Even the region's democracies face many problems when it comes to media freedom, with journalists facing all sorts of different forms of disinformation, for example. And if we look at the annual rankings of media freedom in the world published by Reporters Without Borders, many Asian states are right at the bottom of the rankings. So they rank 180 countries. North Korea comes in at 179, China at 177. Even the highest ranked Asian countries are not particularly high on the listings. So South Korea is rated as being the most free media environment in Asia, and that ranks at number 41. Taiwan comes in at 42 and Japan at 67, which is quite far below other countries of a comparable level of economic development. So our book doesn't pretend to be a neutral academic text. We take a normative position that media freedom is a social good and that obstacles to independent reporting should be challenged. And we conceive of media freedom as the media's right to present and circulate different ideas and information without censorship by the state, by corporate actors or others. And a number of the authors who've contributed chapters to the book are working journalists, and many of them are at the forefront of the battle for media freedom in their countries. And Jeff himself has been blacklisted by the current Japanese government for his commentary, his critical commentary on the creeping nationalism in Japan, and also the intolerance shown by the current administration of media criticism. So for my part of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the common obstacles that various authors in our book identified as being problems for media freedom in Asia. And I'll look at these different constraints under 4 different headings. First, issues to do with state actors and institutions. Second, economics and ownership. Third, journalistic norms and ethics. And finally, new technologies and social media. And in the book, we deal with a vast geographic area. We're looking at countries from India in the southwest of Asia all the way through to Japan in the southeast. And what we don't try to do in the book is to say that there's an Asian model of media, but rather we acknowledge that there's a lot of diversity in newsrooms around Asia, and that media freedom might be conceived of differently in different places. But in all instances, we believe that there's a strong sense of support for a freer media among publics and journalists across Asia. But unfortunately in Asia, the vast majority of citizens do live without free access to information. As the Burmese journalist Hin Win said, freedom of information is freedom that allows you to verify the existence of all other freedoms. So starting with the state then, the assault on media freedom in Asia comes from all sorts of directions and sources, but the state is chief among these obstacles in many Asian countries. And even in the region's more established democracies like Japan, the state has much more influence over the media than in most Western countries. Direct state censorship is still an issue in a number of Asian countries. Asia is home to a number of the world's last remaining communist countries, and in China, Vietnam, North Korea, Laos, the media follows a Soviet model of press, which means that the press effectively act as propagandists for the regime. And in China and Vietnam, things were actually sort of moving in a slightly, very slightly, more positive direction in the early 2000s, with the commercialization of the media leading to some tentative liberalization, with journalists being able to experiment with limited investigative reporting, for example, exposing corruption at a more regional or local level. But more recently, the Chinese government has moved back again towards clamping down on any kind of media dissent. And under President Xi Jinping, the Chinese state has taken very strong measures to control its image both domestically and internationally. And I think we can see with the current coronavirus the sort of attitude of the Chinese state towards media freedom, with the government being more concerned about controlling the spread of information than focusing on the spread of the disease, by arresting, for example, the doctors who were the initial whistleblowers, highlighting that a pandemic may be a possibility. So we've got authoritarian regimes on one hand in Asia who are obviously very restrictive of media freedom, but another group of sort of threats to the media would be posed by populist politicians. And where populists have won power in India, Thailand, and the Philippines, press freedom has been eroded, and in many cases, violence against journalists has also increased. Now, Asia's populists tend to be quite different from the populists that we see more commonly in the West. They focus less on immigration and free trade, but rather instead they tend to focus on stoking religious and ethnic divides and fueling resentment against the cronyism of established political parties. And populists appeal to working and middle-class voters, often frustrated with the political establishment, of which they see the media as being part, for failing to talk about issues to do with inequality, crime, poor public services. And these frustrations are often inflamed on social media. So, for example, in the Philippines, with President Duterte using an army of Facebook followers to troll those who are his critics. And elsewhere in Asia, we see nationalism and national security as being forces that are used, or ideas that are being used to try and curtail journalists' independence. In Japan, Prime Minister Abe and his nationalist supporters have pressured media owners to purge reporters who question their interpretation of Japan's actions in the Second World War, or government plans to water down commitments to pacifism. South Korea's conservative administrations have also used national security laws that prohibit expression of sympathy for North Korea to censor media critics. In other places, very strict defamation and libel laws are used to undermine free expression and also to encourage journalistic self-censorship. I think an example that's probably a favourite for both Jeff and I is the Burmese poet who was thrown into jail for claiming to have a tattoo of the president on his penis, and also subsequently saying that his wife was very upset about this development. So turning to economics and media ownership as a challenge. In this regard, a lot of the challenges that face journalists in Asia are actually quite similar to the challenges that are faced by journalists globally. So these are not regional but global trends in many cases. So these include concentrated ownership and the subordination of public service to the pursuit of profits, the commercialization of the media. So media ownership by a few big corporations with wider economic interests reduces the independence of journalists. As cogs in the capitalist wheel, it becomes difficult for journalists to critique the market or the monopolistic systems that their parent companies use to generate profits. The mainstream media in India, for example, has been criticized for focusing on elite institutions and figures rather than the needs of the poor and the marginalized. And in many Asian countries, the media are actually owned by either cronies of the administration or even by government ministers and their families themselves, therefore totally obliterating any chance that journalists can be a public watchdog. Also in India, several press barons, including ZTV owner Subhash Chandra, have been elected to parliament on the ruling BJP ticket. And in Sri Lanka, the Vijaya newspaper group, which accounts for about 50% of the country's print readership, is owned by the family of the Prime Minister. The rise of online media is also deepening the financial dependence of traditional media on oligarchs or state capital. Across Asia, news sources that are online are becoming more and more important and popular. In Malaysia, 89% of people get their news from the web compared to only 41% in the print media. Japan still has quite a large circulation of newspapers. 39 million copies are sold every day, which is the largest in the world. But for the past decade, circulation rates have dropped by 1 million a year, and last year the drop was actually 2 million, so it seems that this is accelerating. And as the newspaper market is declining, partisan biases and polarisation in the media are increasing. As newspaper proprietors try to carve out a niche audience, they tend to focus more on the ideological wants of one end or the other of the ideological spectrum. And as social media becomes a more important news source, as it is across Asia and in other parts of the world, this is potentially very bad for investigative journalism or long pieces, because social media doesn't lend itself well to those kinds of forms of journalism. The algorithms that are used by Facebook and other social media tend to push up people's news feeds information and posts by their friends and family, and push down news posts. And there are problems with things like searchability. You can't search on Facebook for information. If you read a story and you want to know the background, its interface doesn't allow that kind of curiosity. Competition from all of the sensationalism and conspiracy theories that are available online is generally driving down standards in newsrooms, because unprofitable content, which includes political analysis, is finding that it has fewer and fewer resources. So political news that does exist tends to be framed in terms of games and personal conflicts, neglecting the substance of debates, which might be something familiar to audiences in the UK as well. And turning to journalistic norms, in many Asian societies where reporting on politics or controversial topics can be dangerous, journalists prefer to focus on entertainment or human interest stories as a way of avoiding trouble with the authorities. In many Asian countries, journalists are practicing self-censorship for reasons of self-preservation. Journalists who offend the authorities can lose their lives, their liberty, or even their life. China is currently globally the country that has the most journalists incarcerated. The Committee to Protect Journalists said that the number was 48 as of December last year, but with the recent coronavirus and the attempts to control information, that number is probably higher. And in recent years within Asia, India has been the deadliest place to be a journalist, with the most number of journalists murdered outside of a war zone. It's not just fear of offending the authorities, but also fear of offending civil society groups that can lead journalists to self-censor. So in Indonesia, journalists are very wary, for example, of reporting on issues relating to Islam, since the Christian governor of Jakarta was driven from office and jailed for blasphemy after a viral video mischaracterizing his comments about the Quran launched massive public protests in 2016. Another problem is corruption, which is pervasive in many Asian societies, including in newsrooms. In Indonesia, Myanmar, and the Philippines, a culture of envelope journalism, where journalists are paid to write positive stories about a particular individual or business, or are paid to suppress bad news about individuals, is quite a common practice. But even in countries where salaries for journalists are quite a bit higher, for example in South Korea, there's a common problem of close relationships between government officials and journalists, wining and dining of journalists by politicians, or bestowing of gifts, which has recently been outlawed, which leads to this kind of corrupt practice of suppressing information about particular news sources who one is close to. There are also commercial pressures on journalists who have desires to make money, win ratings, or to break exclusives, which can lead to misinformation or the spreading of fake news. In some cases, reporters are spreading fake news because of sloppy standards, rather than because they're maliciously acting with intent. In Myanmar, where the average age of a journalist is in their early 20s, a lack of professional training or maturity often leads reporters to present stories without adequately checking their reliability and looking into their sources. When I was in Yangon, a lot of young journalists I met told me that they judged their reporting based on the number of likes that they got on Facebook. In Taiwan, which is a very competitive media environment, to get ahead, a lot of journalists take sensational content from social media without, again, checking its reliability and authenticity. In 2018, there was a fake story on social media that was picked up by the mainstream press in Taiwan that said that Taiwanese travelers had been stranded in Osaka airport during a typhoon. And this led to a lot of media criticism of the consulate in Osaka, and subsequently, after lots of media hounding, the head of the consulate committed suicide. There was an investigation into the background of this fake story. Initially, the Taiwanese authorities said the story had come from China, and China was trying to make them look incompetent. But it turned out the story was actually domestic. And in many cases, although there's obviously meddling in by China in Taiwanese politics and media, quite a lot of disinformation comes from this desire to get ahead, from ambitious journalists trying to publish sensational news to get attention. So in some Asian countries, new communication technologies are helping social groups to challenge dominant political powers. But more often, social media and new communication technologies are actually helping governments to extend their control over society. Social media played an important role in getting the message across for Malaysia's opposition, who unexpectedly won a general election in Malaysia in 2018, ending 60 years of quite repressive rule by the governing coalition. And during this election campaign, smartphones and online media like Malaysia Kini, Yahoo News, these are very important alternative news sources to the mainstream newspapers and broadcasters that were mainly aligned with the government. And in contrast to traditional media, online platforms potentially allow citizens to challenge the monopoly control of information production and dissemination by the state or commercial institutions. But rather than the internet creating more diversity of content, in most Asian countries, sites operated by big corporations like Yahoo News, for example, are the most popular news sources. Yahoo News is the most popular source online in Japan and in Taiwan, where it receives visits from about 50% of the population at least once a week. While in South Korea, people prefer Naver, which is the domestic equivalent of Google. So access to iPhones, Facebook, other new technologies doesn't necessarily make people more politically engaged or politically aware. In many countries, there's no virtual public sphere developing, not because of state restrictions or a lack of availability of information or because of commercial algorithms, but people simply prefer online platforms that allow them to gossip, shop, or socialize. Moreover, the networked individualism that characterizes social media is exacerbating social fragmentation and eroding collective action. And this doesn't mean that citizen journalism and online activism aren't influential. It's just a caution that the transformative power of the internet is actually quite limited, and mainly limited, I think, in many cases by consumer culture. So citizen journalism can disrupt dominant power practices and enable much more inclusive democracy. But user-generated content can also undermine rational deliberation, foster celebrity politics, and encourage extremism. Posts on social media contributed to sectarian violence in Myanmar, where Aung San Suu Kyi's personal press spokesman, who's a former military official, has been one of the main sources of fake news about the persecuted Rohingya Muslim minority. For example, he has posted photos purporting to be of Rohingya villagers burning their own homes to the ground rather than the military. The government seeking to repress internet freedom are also using this kind of hate speech as a justification for introducing new legislation cracking down on fake news. And what these pieces of legislation that have been introduced in Singapore, Malaysia, and China seem to be aimed at doing, actually, is allowing the government to suppress discussion on a range of topics, with the government defining what is fake and deciding who's prosecuted. But online communication technologies are allowing Asian governments to develop new systems for stifling free expression, to monitor their critics, to block websites, and to troll their oppositions. Governments use social media to confuse through propaganda and fake news, both at home and abroad. And here, China is particularly adept at exploiting the offensive capabilities of the internet. The Chinese government uses fake posts about various issues to manipulate public opinion, not just at home but across the region, in particular in Taiwan, South Korea, and Australia. China is also innovating its online control mechanisms at home. the government's developing a social credit system that sees journalists who post critical content on social media receiving poor scores, which can result in a ban on travel, a ban on buying property, or a refusal of loans. And China's innovations are being watched with envy by repressive regimes around the world. So in conclusion then, based on all these challenges that I've outlined, unsurprisingly, trust in the media is very low in many Asian countries. Actually, I looked at some data from the Reuters Institute today, and Japan actually has the lowest rate of trust in the media of any electoral democracy in Asia. 17% of Japanese people say they trust the media. On the economic side, growing commercial competition is exacerbating the trend towards tabloidization, and in some cases is increasing financial dependence on the state. So overall then, the outlook is pretty gloomy. The enemies of the free press are successfully undermining information systems, using intimidation and violence against journalists, and using the technologies that journalists use to deliver the news to disorientate, demoralize, and disinform the public. But the battle isn't lost. I think one of the reasons why we're seeing such a strong crackdown on media freedom in Asia in recent years is because new technologies are enabling people to communicate in new ways and to get around some of the regulations and restrictions that governments have imposed. And to end on an optimistic note, despite what I said earlier, advocates of media freedom across Asia, including many of the people who wrote for our book, have shown they will not be silenced. And I think one of them's sitting next to me.
No, Tina is a very hard act to follow. I want to thank the organizers for inviting us to promote our book. I want to thank you all for coming out on such a dreary, cold, rainy evening. Very nostalgic for the mid-70s when I came to England as a study abroad. And it seemed the first 3 months I was here, it just rained incessantly. So coming back, I felt, home sweet home. Well, now she ended on an optimistic note. I'll get us back to the pessimistic tone of the evening. The coronavirus, I think, highlights the importance of a free press and the dangers of censorship. Local, regional, and national government authorities in China try to put a lid on the story. They silence the whistleblowers. They try to deny and downplay the problem until they are overwhelmed by it. And, this is not only happening in China, but certainly China has a lot more levers to manipulate the press and to intervene in social media to promote the state's preferred narrative. So now we're reading about how in China the coronavirus outbreak is contained. Do we really believe it? Do the Chinese people really credit it? Maybe it's true. But what we do know is the state is intervening to take down investigative essays that challenge the state's narrative of containment. And they're taking down comments critical of the state's narrative. So that leads one to presume that perhaps it's not as contained as they're talking about. And the Chinese state is disseminating fake news and suggesting that actually the pandemic started in the United States. I have a lot of friends I email back and forth in China. One of them was one of our contributors. And it seems that a lot more people are skeptical of the state's version of events. And they're beginning to challenge that. But we'll get back to China later. I just want to focus on the book. We have 6 chapters on South Asia, 6 on Southeast Asia, and 7 on East Asia. During the process, when you're preparing the book, you go through the copy editing stage, and we send out the copy edited chapters to each of the contributors. And just as we were sending out the copy edited version, Modi pulled the plug on the internet in Kashmir. So our Kashmir contributor actually had, a student will say, oh, the dog ate my homework. Well, he had Modi pulled the plug on the internet. But I sent it out to his email anyway, and heard nothing for 3-4 weeks. And suddenly, somehow, he managed to get it, and replied and made some changes, and so it did happen. But he'd be a person who's certainly in danger. And many of the other people, for example, in Bangladesh and Pakistan and other countries, Sri Lanka, these people put their lives at risk. Our contributor on China, we agreed to label as anonymous out of fear of reprisals. My own chapter is on the Reuters saga, where 2 journalists were arrested because of their reporting about the ethnic clearance operations targeting the Rohingya in Rakhine State and in Myanmar. In my research for that story, I interviewed the penis poet, and he assured me he didn't have any tattoos at all. He didn't have a wife at the time, but he had just recently been engaged, and his wife's parents have a sense of humor about his notoriety. Well, what happened in the Reuters case is essentially journalists were arrested for doing their job very well. They found information implicating soldiers in rounding up villagers, Rohingya, and executing them. And so when I went there, I've been going to Myanmar since '92. I have a lot of contacts there who are involved in the pro-democracy movement. And I was really surprised in 2017 when sort of the international condemnation was very high, and the clearance operations have been more or less concentrated from the end of August until the end of November. I went and talked to a lot of these people, and they were rallying around the military and Aung San Suu Kyi, and one of them told me, well, they were all homesick. That's why they went to Bangladesh. And I was like, this person has a PhD. I think, surely you can do better than that. 730,000 people all got homesick at the same time. So I was really sort of surprised, like, why are they buying the military's line? And then they had the court proceedings. And that was the Wizard of Oz moment, when suddenly it all became clear. A police officer testified, I was instructed to plant information on them and then arrest them for having that information. He says this in court. And then, there's all sorts of other dodgy evidence that was disproved. I interviewed their the lawyer for the 2 journalists. And the problem was that Aung San Suu Kyi said, these journalists have violated the state secrets, official secrets law. And so she had already declared that they were guilty. So what's the judge supposed to do in that circumstance? I mean, are you going to defy the lady and say she's wrong? So of course he judged them guilty. And there's certainly a lot of pressure because Myanmar had taken on the wrong enemy. Reuters is incredibly influential. The reach of Reuters into boardrooms, into top political leadership in governments all around the world meant that they could shine a limelight where the Myanmar government doesn't want it shown. And they kept the pressure up, and so finally, in May of 2019, they were pardoned, but their conviction was not overturned. And part of the deal, and it was murky, basically they had to leave the country, and they've been going to different countries outside of Myanmar, but they weren't allowed to go to Singapore for some reason. Anyway, so the Reuters story, I guess, shows that a free press can do a lot to change things, but the fate of the Rohingya hasn't changed at all. But certainly the legacy of Aung San Suu Kyi has changed dramatically from what we anticipated just a few years ago when she was the Nelson Mandela of her country. Now, as Tina said, China is, a great source of fake news. I think the 3 contributors in our book all believe it's probably the leading source of fake news in the world, whether it's about the incarceration of over 1 million Uyghurs because they're Muslim, or the ethnocide ongoing in Tibet, whether it's the suppression of Hong Kong democracy movement, or now the coronavirus. China is disseminating lots of fake news, and they are intervening extensively in social media to shape the story. Louisa Lim, who worked for a long time in China as a journalist and now is at the University of Melbourne teaching journalism, she, in her chapter on borrowed boats, talks about how China invests in overseas media as a way to get sort of a veneer of legitimacy. So when people find an insert in their newspaper from China Daily, because it's with the newspaper they're familiar with, it sort of gains a certain status that it wouldn't have if it was just coming directly, from China. So people might not believe CCTV, but suddenly if there are news stories that are favorable to China in media groups that China has influence over, her argument is this is the way they sort of have an insidious influence in shaping the narrative about China. And then we have another contributor, David Moser, who talks about how the legacy of increasing censorship under Xi Jinping is actually harming the national interest, and it is blinkering the leadership in coping with the various challenges that China has. Moving now to Japan, because I promised I'd talk mostly about Japan. Andrew Horvath, who's a veteran journalist, former president of the press club in Japan, now teaches in Josai International University in Chiba. He actually has a sort of more positive take on the media's role in Japan in terms of promoting reconciliation and ensuring there is no collective amnesia about Japan's shared past with Asia. So he identifies a number of journalists who have played a prominent role in trying to promote reconciliation and reminding the nation, what Japan did. And so they have, in a sense, played a very positive role, and a lot of depictions of Japan suffering from collective amnesia overlook this. However, in my view, over the last 5 years or so, sort of coinciding with the rule of Shinzo Abe, the revisionists have sort of prevailed. And I'd say that the efforts of the media to promote reconciliation have been overwhelmed by the efforts of the revisionists to suppress what they call a masochistic history. The other contribution on Japan is by Justin Mccurry. You might be familiar with his work for The Guardian, great journalist. He focuses on Okinawa and the US bases there, and he questions the nostrums of shared values that are often invoked as the foundation of the US-Japan alliance, pointing out that the democratic voice of the Okinawans has been repeatedly ignored. Various elections and referendums, the Okinawans want to reduce the American military footprint there. They're totally opposed to building a new base in Henoko. And then he points to one particular journalist who worked for the Tokyo Shimbun, and she's at the Prime Minister's office, participating in the Keisha Club. And she starts asking very pointed questions about the environmental damage being done with the landfill, because they're supposed to use gravel, but instead, in Okinawa, you can get lots of red clay, but red clay has a high iron content, and this is very damaging to the coral. So she asked several questions to the chief cabinet spokesman, Suga, and he just got very angry, and he just ignored her and wouldn't answer her questions. And none of the other members of the Keisha Club came to support her. That they all didn't want to risk their own access to sort of defend her. And so she was seen to sort of have broken the rules. Mochizuki was her name. And she was sort of isolated. And this sort of is a problem, I think, in general about access journalism and the Keisha clubs in Japan, is it's a way of preventing media solidarity. And so I think that Justin did a very good job of discussing the Okinawa issue and why this is problematic in terms of press freedom and how the press deals with that. And essentially, access journalism in the Keisha clubs means that only mainstream media are allowed in the Keisha Club. So, for example, your newspaper will assign you to the Ministry of Agriculture, And so you will have an office in the Ministry of Agriculture. You'll have privileged access to the people working there. But that access comes with, constraints. You can't tell all you know. Because if you divulge more than the people you interact with want you to talk about, you will be sort of pushed to the side, you will be ignored. So this is in a way how the government manages the news. And means that journalists are pulling their punches, they're co-opted, they're complacent. There's a great report out by the UN rapporteur named David Kay, came out in 2017, the same year that another book I edited on press freedom in Japan came out. And he talks about the problem of the Keisha clubs and the problem of self-censorship, and how self-censorship is really problematic. The other thing he noted is he interviewed dozens of Japanese journalists, and none of them wanted to be quoted by name because they feared reprisals, not from the government, but from their own editors. Another problem is that when Abe came to power, they decided to name a new head of NHK, a man with no previous media experience. NHK is like the BBC. And his first press conference, he really sort of hit the trifecta. He downplayed the comfort women issue, and then he demonstrated his command of freedom of expression by saying, well, if the government says right, we can't say left. Right? So more or less he says that our job is to voice the government's perspective. And then under his reign, they came out with something called the Orange Book of phrases that you may not use and phrases that you have to use. So you can never use the word controversial related to Yasukuni Shrine. You cannot call the comfort women sex slaves. You can't call the wartime workers forced labor. So all sorts of taboos were introduced which were consistent with the Abe government's historical revisionism. And by revisionism I mean minimizing and whitewashing the past, trying to rehabilitate the 1930s and 1940s and try to promote a more positive narrative of Japan's shared past with Asia. So one thing I've written about is, could there be a Japanese Spotlight? Spotlight was the Oscar-winning movie about the Boston Globe uncovering the Roman Catholic Church's cover-up of pedophile priests. So could there be something similar in Japan? Well, the Asahi actually tried. They created something called the Prometheus Unit. They set it up after Fukushima because the editors felt embarrassed and ashamed. For the first 2 months after the 3 nuclear reactor meltdowns, the Japanese media never mentioned meltdowns. The international media was writing all about it. In Japan, it was a cloak of silence. So the Asahi said, oh, this is so embarrassing. I mean, how could we just miss this story completely? So they put together an investigative unit, and they were charged with doing what journalists often do in the West, which is do investigative journalism and uncover the stories that the state and TEPCO didn't want the public to know about. They won a few Pulitzer Prizes for their efforts, but of course they made big enemies. And so there was an orchestrated attack on the Asahi led by Sankei Shimbun and the Yomiuri, and they particularly targeted the Asahi over stories related to the comfort women and the Fukushima nuclear accident, and the Asahi editor folded, and they disbanded the unit, and one of their star reporters was put in charge of making travel arrangements for his colleagues. So the Asahi is generally seen to be like the Guardian, the New York Times, the torch of freedom and liberalism, but in this case, the editors caved. The interesting thing is they made threats on the internet against one of the former Asahi journalists for articles that he did not write in the early 1990s. but who cares who wrote them? Uemura was the target. And so on the internet, these net uyoku, the internet trolls, threatened violence at the university where he was teaching if he wasn't fired. Do you think that that would mean the government would unleash the police to find out who these people are? But in the Diet, Abe was actually voicing support for the campaign targeting the Asahi because that newspaper had long been a nemesis for Abe. So hardball is the name of the game under the Abe regime. During 2015 and 16, a number of prominent pundits were ousted from their positions, including Hiroko Kuniya, who had long been the host of Close-Up Gendai, which was an investigative program that was, by Japanese standards, pretty hard-hitting. And also other pundits who were critical of Abe were ousted. And so this was meant to sort of, a shot over the bow of the other journalists to intimidate others, say, this could happen to you because here are 3 media stars that we have pushed out. So the rest of you better do what you're told and not rock the boat. But of course, people still do. Now, the interesting thing is the revisionists in Abe feel emboldened. But more odd is that Gaimusho, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has actually facilitated this. They have worked hard to promote the revisionist agenda and to target journalists who are critical of that. A German correspondent for the Frankfurter Allgemeine, Carsten Gurmis, he was accused of being a Chinese spy and taking money from China because he was criticizing Abe's historical revisionism. Of course, revisionism is a very sensitive topic in Germany. And naturally, a German correspondent would feel it's important for his readers to know what's going on in terms of Abe's efforts to rewrite Japan's wartime history. But instead, they made these unfounded, no shred of evidence produced that Karsten was a spy for the Chinese. Martin Fackler, who was the New York Times bureau chief, told me that he was taken out to a very nice lunch, then brought back to the ministry, and he sat down and said, can you write an apology? He goes, for what? Your predecessor's reporting on the Comfort Woman was inaccurate, so you need to write an apology. He's like, really? He's like, and if you don't, you won't get an interview with Abe. So he got up, walked out, and said, wow, I didn't think I was in China. He never got his interview with Abe, but I don't think it really mattered. Also, the Japanese embassy in Washington called on the press handler in Tokyo, the Gaimusho assigned somebody to handle the international press, and said, there are these unreliable commentators who are often critical of Abe. Can you instruct the Foreign Press Corps not to interview them? Instead, interview these other people. And indeed, the press corps told me, because I was one of the unreliables, Koichi Nakano was another one of the unreliables, that we were called unreliable and that we shouldn't be interviewed. But of course, it's like waving a red flag, in front of the press, saying, don't interview these people by giving you the good housekeeping seal of approval. Right? So it showed a fundamental misunderstanding of the press and thinking that the same tactics they use in Japan can be used against international journalists. Now, finally, I'll talk about the Japan Times saga. I wrote for the Japan Times since 1988. I had a column with them for 3.5 years on a weekly basis, and suddenly I was fired. Out of the blue, no warning, just said, we don't have any room for your column anymore. And I said, why? Well, we just don't have space. And about 2 months before that, the Japan Times had been bought by an owner much more sympathetic to Abe. And former ambassador Hugh Cortazzi was also found that his column there was no space for. And several other Abe critics, suddenly there was no space for their columns. But they were replaced by people there was space for who seemed to have a more favorable opinion. So we, amongst ourselves, thought perhaps there was a bit of a purge of people critical of Abe, but there was no smoking gun until a little over a year ago. Reuters published a story based on a tape in which the top editorial team met with the staff and the reporters because they're all upset about this weaselly wording that they decided to use to refer to the comfort women and to forced laborers. It basically tried to murky the water, saying, well, women who were forced to serve in brothels, some of them against their will, and to provide sex to the Japanese troops or something. So they, each time they referred, and they would change actually, you know, the Kyoto, AP, Bloomberg stories, and they would actually change the wording of their stories to conform with the Japan Times line. The Japan Times wording on this was similar to NHK and similar to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So led to one of my colleagues referring to the Japan Times as Pravda on the Sumida. In this tape, the editor said, well, by firing Kingston, we could get more government ads, and I could get an exclusive interview with Prime Minister Abe. So I was happy to take one for the team, but it was very embarrassing for the newspaper to have it come out that actually it was a politically motivated vendetta. And you heard it here first. That editor has recently been ousted, and he's no longer the chief editor. And the president has been ousted by the owner, or not president, publisher. And so now they're in flux. There have been a large number of cuts. They're trying to convince older staff to take early retirement. So Japan Times is encountering a number of financial difficulties, but they are now reverting to the original wording referring to comfort women and forced laborers, and they're no longer engaged in the weasel wording that they had under the previous management. But we'll have to see how many changes there are in the story. Anyway, thank you.